Scene 1. First Families. The wilderness beyond the mountains was no longer just rumor. Word had spread through the settlements of the Holston, the Yadkin, the New River, and the Carolina backcountry that far beyond the Cumberland Gap lay rich land, salt springs, open range, and a river valley untouched by settlement. And so, in the autumn of 1779, families began to move west. Not as soldiers, not as explorers, but as fathers, mothers, children, servants, laborers, and farmers carrying everything they owned into a wilderness few white settlers had ever seen. James Robertson left first by land, in company with his brothers Mark and John, his 10-year-old son Jonathan, and several others. Robertson pushed westward through the Cumberland Mountains, driving horses, cattle, hogs, and sheep before him. There were only 12 or 15 in the party. Some of the men hired others to row their families downriver, while they themselves crossed through Kentucky so they could carry their stock overland into the Cumberland country. Robertson rode at the front. Guided by compass, he blazed a path through the wilderness for those behind him. The horses came first, then the cattle, then the hogs, and finally the sheep driven by his oldest son, Jonathan.
Many nights the party camped at sundown. Yet hours later, Jonathan would still be somewhere in the dark hills struggling to bring in the flock. One old ram repeatedly broke away into the mountains, forcing the boy to chase him on foot through the wilderness. When Jonathan finally caught him, the ram would knock him to the ground. The journey west was not a single migration, but many. Along the Kentucky Trace, small companies appeared ahead and behind one another, moving through the same dangerous corridor toward the Cumberland. John Rains later remembered meeting Robertson in Powell's Valley before reaching Cumberland Gap. Robertson persuaded him to abandon his plans for Kentucky and join the movement west to the Cumberland instead. Together, the parties crossed through the Gap and followed the old trace roads north and west through the Kentucky wilderness. They moved along the ridges between the Salt River and Dix River, crossed the waters of the Green River country, past Elk Lick and the Barrens, then turned southward toward Red River, Manskers Creek, and finally the French Lick on the Cumberland. Other families followed close behind. The Heaton party came west from the Holston with 8 families. The Buchanan and Williams companies came from South Carolina, waiting months until their numbers were large enough to cross the mountains safely. By then, fear already traveled ahead of the settlements. Small parties were vulnerable. Larger companies stood a better chance of survival. On Christmas Eve, one migration party reached White's Creek, only a mile from the Cumberland River. Exhausted settlers cut cane along the banks and threw down their packs in the winter cold. Some pitched tents. Others built rough half-faced camps and waited for spring. There was no town waiting for them. No fort, no streets. Only scattered camps, frozen ground, and the dark wilderness surrounding them. By December of 1779, Robertson's party finally reached the Cumberland settlements. They wintered their stock near Manskers Creek, where pasture could still be found. Toward the end of February, with the river frozen hard enough to bear weight, Robertson's horses and cattle were driven across the ice over the Cumberland River near the mouth of the Big Branch. There, in the dead of winter, they began construction on what would later be known as Freeland Station. They had come seeking land, opportunity, and a future for their families. But few yet understood the full danger waiting beyond the Cumberland.
While Robertson and the overland parties pushed west through Kentucky, another migration gathered along the frozen banks of the Holston River. These families would attempt the journey by water. In the fall of 1779, Colonel John Donaldson spread word throughout Virginia and the Holston settlements that land waited near the French Lick on the Cumberland River. Any man willing to build a cabin, raise corn, and endure danger and privation could claim it. Young men answered quickly. So did entire families. Some came seeking land. Others came seeking survival. Many came believing the Western country offered the only chance to improve their condition in life. At the Long Island of the Holston, the migration grew into a moving frontier society. Cabins and camps stretched for miles along the frozen riverbanks. Men cut timber and shaped flatboats through the winter. Others hollowed enormous dugout canoes from giant poplar trees. William Neely carved one canoe 56 feet long from a single trunk and weighted it with 7 grindstones for ballast. There were hunters, farmers, widows, children, servants, enslaved laborers. Livestock crowded the camps. Deer, turkey, geese, and ducks fed the migrants through the hard winter, though often not well enough. By spring, nearly 300 people had gathered along the river. Some 40 flatboats, bateaux, and canoes stood ready for departure. At night, the campfires stretched for nearly 10 miles along the Holston. Mary Donaldson later remembered that the fires strung along the riverbank made quite a show. The migrants prepared not simply to survive the journey, but to build permanent homes. Robert Cartwright packed apple cuttings in clay kegs so orchards could someday grow in the Cumberland country. He mounted a small swivel cannon onto his boat. Others loaded rifles and muskets beside household goods, tools, seed, livestock, and children. Charlotte Robertson left her home, at the mouth of Big Creek on the Holston, for the purpose of joining her husband. Her party consisted of herself and 4 small children. Her brother, William Reeves, her husband's brother, Charles Robertson, her sister-in-law, Anne Robertson Johnston, and 3 little nieces, 2 white men, both servants, and a Negro woman, Hagar, and her infant. These were conveyed in 2 small flatboats. On Donaldson's flagship, the Adventure, Anne Johnston organized the children into a school during the journey west. Even in the wilderness, these families believed they were building a civilization. Then, on December 22, 1779, the flotilla pushed away from Fort Patrick Henry and entered the river. The current carried them westward into snow, ice, wilderness, and uncertainty. John Donaldson simply recorded, "Took our departure from the fort on December 22, 1779. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of dangerous river, hostile territory, disease, hunger, and death. But somewhere beyond the mountains and rivers, James Robertson and the first overland settlers were already waiting beside the frozen Cumberland.